So hello, good evening, and welcome to this roundtable discussion about the role of ultrasound in community diagnostic centres. I'm Lord Renard, but please always call me Chris. In fact, everyone calls me Chris. That is apart from the attendants in the House of Lords who have to be formal, and perhaps my wife, if she feels a bit sarcastic and wants to know if His Lordship would like another cup of tea. The answer to which is always yes. So I'm your host tonight because I do some work with AXREM, who through their special focus group on ultrasound work closely with BMUS. Between them, I have to say they've brought together a brilliant panel for our discussion this evening. And BMUS has created the opportunity for this discussion to be part of their annual scientific conference. AXREM members, of course, often attend this event and exhibit at it when it's held in person, as I hope it can be in future. AXREM, I should say at this point, is of course the trade association representing the suppliers of diagnostic medical imaging, radiotherapy, healthcare IT, and care equipment in the UK. What we're doing this evening follows an event which AXREM organised last June as part of the UK IO conference, discussing the implementation of Sir Mike Richards' report that was published in October 2020. His report, of course, was called Recovery and Renewal, the report of the independent review of diagnostic services for NHS England. The theme for tonight is the role of ultrasound in community diagnostic centres, or CDCs. We're absolutely delighted to have with us Professor Sir Mike Richards himself, Andy Howlett, who was part of the discussion in June and who is the Director of Diagnostics, Medicines and Pharmacy Improvement at NHS England and Improvement, Pamela Parker, the President of the BMUS, Professor Adrian Lim, who is a Professor of Practice and Consultant Radiologist and also the President-elect of BMUS, and finally, Roy Tappin, Regional General Manager UKI Ultrasound at GE Healthcare, and Harlesh Vadera, Head of Ultrasound at Siemens, who will do a double act at the conclusion of our presentations. The panel will all be talking about the need to transform diagnostic services delivery in the NHS, and it'll focus on the need to provide more community-based diagnostic facilities close to patients' homes, away from acute hospitals, and in line with both the NHS Long Term Plan and Sir Mike Richards' report. And it'll emphasise the important role that ultrasound will play in these community diagnostic centres. We will have time for questions, as most of the panel have been asked to keep their remarks to about 5 minutes each. So please can you ask your questions using the chat function and place them there at any time so that I can see what areas are covered and group them together as appropriate. You may want to target them at individual panelists, all of them, or some of them. And please also make use of Twitter, as we need to get our message out there. And you can use the handles at AXREM, at BMUS_ultrasound, and the hashtag ultrasound 2021. We'll begin in a moment with Professor Sir Mike Richards, who has the challenging task of explaining the vision, purpose, and benefits of transforming diagnostic service delivery in the NHS through the CDCs and the role that ultrasound plays in about 7 minutes. I feel like saying, that's your mission. Should you accept it? Thank you, Mike, and over to you.
I do accept it, Chris. Thank you very much. With pleasure. And just to say good evening, everybody, but also to explain I am not an expert on ultrasound. Fortunately, we have others coming after me who are. But I think what my task is to set the scene on diagnostics generally, and to explain where my report came from. And Chris, you've already alluded to the fact that this was linked with the NHS Long Term Plan, which was published in 2019. And as part of that, I was actually asked to look at the whole question of diagnostics, because I think Simon Stevens and others at the head of NHS England recognised that unless we did something pretty major on diagnostics, we were not going to achieve the commitments in the long-term plan for cancer, for heart disease, for stroke, for musculoskeletal conditions, for respiratory disease, the lot. And so I'd started work before the pandemic came along, and it was already clear then that in terms of our diagnostic capacity in this country, that's both in terms of the number of machines we've got, but also in terms of the workforce, we were way down on other countries. Demand was rising, and we could see that we did have information on, and frankly, we were reaching a tipping point with waiting times getting longer and having to outsource more and more simply because we couldn't do a lot of the work within the NHS. And then along came the pandemic, and it made everything a whole lot worse. Very temporarily, it made things less bad because people weren't getting referred. But then as people now are being referred again, demand is going back up. And although I think I would just like to say people in the NHS are doing a fantastic job, we are back to, broadly speaking, where we were pre-pandemic in terms of the activity. But because there's more work coming through, actually waiting times are getting longer, and others can talk about that in greater detail. So my report effectively said two things. We have to get more capacity, that's more machines, but importantly, more people, more trained workforce. But secondly, that we need to do things differently. And the biggest single change there was about separating out what I'm calling acute diagnostics, the diagnostics required by A&E departments and for inpatients, where things tend to need to be done either within the hour or certainly on the same day, from what I'm calling elective diagnostics, all the referrals coming from GPs directly, and also a lot of the referrals coming from secondary care outpatient clinics. But it's not just that. We know that we need digital connectivity. We know we need to work in networks. We know we need better data. We need better leadership of all these things. Now, the good news was that the government did respond to my report quite quickly. And we got some funding that's actually for this current financial year, and now we've got more for coming up in future years, and I'm sure Andy Howlett can tell us more about the detail of that. But we've got more funding, and so what we're doing is putting that into these community diagnostic hubs. Why separate it out to community? Because most acute hospital sites are absolutely overburdened anyway, and if no other way, you can't even park a car there. So and the good news is we're now getting these community diagnostic hubs up and running, and all of them, the standard model, will have CT scanning, MRI, ultrasound, and plain X-ray. They'll also have a range of physiological measurements, ECGs and echoes and things like that. And they will also have a phlebotomy. Then on top of that, some larger ones will have endoscopy, and they could have almost anything else on top of that. And then some may be mobile, going out as a sort of hub and spoke pattern. So I'm really pleased that things do seem to be getting underway, but I would stress again that I think the greatest challenge is going to be getting the workforce. And I'm sure we will hear more about that as the evening goes on. So I think there's good news, but that good news is tempered by the fact that there's an awful lot of work to do to get the workforce. I'll end there, Chris, but happy to come back to me later on.
Thank you, Mike. Very insightful as ever. We will no doubt come back to you later on. The issues, of course, of the workforce and all the problems of the NHS were featured a number of times yesterday when we had the second reading in the House of Lords of the Health and Care Bill. And you mentioned, of course, Simon Stevens, as was. Sorry, forgive me with the bell. While Andy's speaking in a few minutes, I'll cast my vote on my mobile phone. That's the modern technology we have, even the House of Lords now. In the old days, the people who lived in the houses around here used to send their servants into the House of Lords to cast their votes for them. Nowadays, you could, I suppose, hand your phone to somebody else, but that would be a corrupt practice to do that. But Lord Stevens, as he now is, was of course introduced to the House of Lords a little while ago and made his maiden speech yesterday. A very impressive maiden speech in the Lords, as I may say so. And all of the issues which you're all talking about now, I'm sure people will be writing letters to the Lord Stevens of Birmingham at the House of Lords, or even emailing him. Our email addresses are all available, and asking him to keep pressing these issues. As he said, he was so supportive of your original report. And now what we're going to do is move on, as we did in last June's discussion, to Andy Howlett, who gave us then. So I hope the bell isn't disturbing you too much. It's quite loud in my ears, but I hadn't anticipated this. Anyway, Andy last June gave us a great deal of reassurance that the long-term investment needed will be available to implement the recommendations of your report. But as they say, a week is a long time in politics. So what we've asked Andy to do tonight is tell us what he thinks now about how what was perhaps historically the underinvestment in diagnostic imaging will actually be addressed. So Andy, thank you very much indeed again. The bell shouldn't ring while you're speaking, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and pleasure to be here this evening. As usual, I'm following Sir Mike in giving my comments. I'm getting quite used to that. So I'm going to build on what Mike has shared. So obviously the key centrepiece of the Richards review was the call to create community diagnostic centres. And within our design guidance for those planning these at local level, non-obstetric ultrasound is a core element of the service model, and that is being borne out in the mobilisation of those services across the country, which has been taking place since July of this year, supported by an investment of capital and revenue funding from government to support the programme. And since that discussion in the summer, I'm really pleased to say that the government spending review has further supported the programme, and over a 3-year period, giving us again a capital and revenue allocation of funding to continue the rollout of the community diagnostic centres across the whole of England, and seeking to get as close as we can to Sir Mike's challenge to create 3 CDCs per million population, as well as continuing to invest in further community diagnostic centres, which obviously will deliver investment in ultrasound services for patients. We'll continue to focus on bringing those that we've mobilised this year, which we've done at great speed to support the recovery of NHS elective services post-pandemic, up to the full specification. Many of those that have been initiated running a partial service model, and our goal is to get those all those centres up to full specification as quickly as possible. So those that have started perhaps without ultrasound services being a part of them at the moment should see those investments in ultrasound over the next 1, 2, 3 years as we build on the success that we've achieved so far. And I just had a quick look at the activity report. We're getting weekly numbers through from the centres that we have got going this year, and really pleased to say that we've delivered over 28,000 additional non-obstetric ultrasound examinations since July across the NHS through the CDC programme, and that's actually ahead of the target that the centres had set themselves. So clearly doing slightly better than we had expected, which is great. Keen to emphasise, as well as the capital investment, there is revenue support. So there are commissioners will be funded for the running costs of the CDCs. That will cover the workforce and the ongoing costs of maintaining the equipment and running the service. But obviously Sir Mike's review, and he's highlighted this again just now, highlighted the need for investment in both equipment and the workforce, and I think the workforce is absolutely critical. There are a number of activities going on within the national team at NHS England Improvement, but one of those is continuing to lobby government to ensure that or to establish sonography as a regulated profession in its own right, and working very closely with Health Education England to expand training capacity. And we see that being delivered to some degree through the regional imaging academies, which we are also expanding this year with investment to create 4 additional academies and put more money into those that already exist, and ensure that they are multi-professional learning centres. So we should see training in ultrasonography being a core part of the offer from those 7 regional imaging academies. I think as well as investing in the training pipeline and the supply of more highly skilled sonographers through the established processes, we need to look really hard at how we can innovate in the workforce and how we can use support workers and apprenticeships as an opportunity to build a skills escalator and a career structure for individuals seeking to enter the diagnostic imaging and ultrasound services. And my final comment would be to highlight the role that community diagnostic centres will play as an incubator of some of that workforce innovation. They will be, I think, unique. Maybe that's not the right word, but they will bring together a concentrated set of skills and expertise of the diagnostic professionals who run these services, in most cases scattered across acute hospitals in small departments, not working together particularly, and that opportunity of concentrating that expertise in one place, we hope and expect to foster opportunities for working in different ways, and perhaps extending the available workforce for ultrasound, and extending competence training and credentials for undertaking ultrasound to a wider group, and helping solve that workforce shortage that we're currently experiencing. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you very much indeed for your participation, which is incredibly welcome in this event. No doubt, all the people involved in these issues will continue asking about the issues of equipment and the most modern equipment and make it efficient, and upskilling the workforce and the staff shortages. And you're no doubt following some of what we're talking about in Parliament on these very issues, but you're the person actually having to deliver it. And we admire greatly the effort you're personally making to drive forward all these things that are so important. We've already had a question in from Catherine Kirkpatrick, but I'll come to the questions at the end of the presentations rather. And before that, we're going to go next to the president of BMUS, Pamela Parker. And Pamela's going to talk to us about how she sees things from the standpoint of being a sonographer and how we can quickly scale up to meet the demands. So Pamela, without further ado, if you don't mind, perhaps you could talk to us.
Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks for inviting me today. So my role as BMUS president is to represent a multidisciplinary society, so not just sonography, but clearly one of the big demands is for non-obstetric ultrasound is who's going to do it, and normally the vast majority of that workload is going to be done by sonographers. So I've kind of considered what the barriers are for getting this right, and to put through the activity that both Mike and Andy have discussed, and working with the academies. And I think there are actually 5 barriers that we need to explore, and it's not just necessarily about equipment and workforce, and I'm just going to take them in turn. And the first one is about pathways, and I know there's some work being done on national optimization of pathways, but they tend to be anatomy or pathology driven, so for instance prostate cancer driven, and because within that ultrasound could well sit within that, but I'm talking more about local pathways, and are we doing the right test for the patient? And if they come to me via outpatient setting, are we doing the right test because Mr. X has always done an ultrasound for right upper quadrant pain, whereas Mr. Y in a different clinic always does a CT? So there has to be quite a lot of joined up thinking, both locally, regionally and nationally, about which is the right test for the correct presentation. And building on that, the pathways then need to be embedded within primary care, within the ED departments, within imaging, and within the secondary care or onward referral. Because if a patient presents in primary care and comes through a known pathway that's got ultrasound, and they get referred into secondary care, that joined up pathway needs to be recognised and acknowledged so that the patient doesn't end up with a duplication of tests. So we look at pathways, and one of the fixes and one of the solutions about increasing activity through CDCs is plain film and plain film reporting, CT reporting. That can all be done remotely, but with sonography it can't be. It's got to be hands-on contact to the patient, and we need to make sure that patient contact counts. So is there an extra role that the sonographer could do that potentially currently is done by either a nurse, as in the communication or the discussions of pathways, discussions of findings, discussions of onward referrals? Is there something that could be done in terms of social prescribing? Can we link into smoking cessation? Can we look into some of the obesities? Are there things like that the sonographer could do? Because this is a really valuable patient contact time that we perhaps are missing. I think we also need to look at the pathways in terms of the competition for that sonographer's time. We recognise we don't have enough sonographers, but yesterday we were talking about obstetrics and the vast demand for obstetric services because the pathways within obstetrics are changing. And these sonographers quite frequently are multi-skilling. They're doing non-obstetric and obstetrics. So that is only one person. So we need to make sure that the impact of additional non-obstetric pathways isn't conflicting with the demands for additional obstetric pathways. And one of the things with the CDCs is we're looking just primarily and purely at non-obstetric. So this is a barrier when there's competing time for this precious resource, and making sure that we've got the right communications with GPs, ED and onward referrers is something that as a society, a multidisciplinary society, we're key party to do that. So that leads me on to the second barrier, and it's duplication. If we don't get the right test for that patient within the CDC, then do we end up duplicating it? Or if the patient is scanned within a CDC that the secondary care referrer isn't aware of, has never seen before, is there a question of faith in the report? So as you know, sonography is hands-on, it's reported by the operator. Quite commonly, the confidence in that report is down to whose name's at the bottom of it. So we just need to make sure that our work within CDCs is audited and reflected on to the same degree that it would be in secondary care now, so that those teams are working together, so the standards of practice are the same, so the confidence in that report doesn't lead to duplication of test. And what we've seen with any qualified providers when back in the day GP fund holders setting up ultrasound clinics, is there was vast amount of duplication from a secondary or an independent sector provider. And that leads me on to the third barrier, and it's down to competition. So who is actually going to own and manage the CDCs? And there is a worry in my role as a manager of services that if an independent sector provider comes in and manages and owns the CDC, there's a risk that their pay and conditions are better. There's a risk that they've got incentivised payments. There's a risk that they don't have to work weekends. The threat of on-call will diminish. And we have to make sure that the terms and conditions and working environments are not a detriment to our acute sites. And that's, again, another difficult conversation to have. But we already see, even within competing trusts, where there is incentivised pay and disparity of payment for sonographers because they're such a pressured resource. We know that the agency staff are paid far greater than employed secondary care staff, and that leads to disharmony, but also the responsibility of those agency staff is much less because they're not going to be in that department for a long time. So we have to, that is another barrier that we really need to overcome. If we get the right numbers of staff, terms and conditions need to be the same so we don't have drift. I also think one of the barriers is leadership. And sonographers, in some respects, we have to hold our hand up and have ourselves to blame. We get paid for the responsibility and the accountability that we take for that patient care and that report. But in actual fact, we're doing much more than that, and we need to step up a bit. We need to step up and really meet the 4 pillars of advanced practice. It's an absolute tragedy and shame that within sonography, we think there's between only 20 or 30 consultant sonographers. And these consultant sonographers are the leaders of the future. They should be working with pathway development. They should be working with people like Andy to make sure that we've got the right equipment for the right tests in the right centres. They need to be working with people like Adrian so that there's a cross communication and making sure that the consultants of the future can lead their services and lead their sonographers, lead an inspired team. And I don't think enough is being done to really address this imbalance. And we need to promote the career structure of sonographers. We can only do that if we actually identify what those sonographers can do. And as you'll be aware, sonographers come in as graduates, usually from radiography background. So they've already got a baseline degree, and they come in because we recognise their responsibilities at a pay band 7, which equates to an advanced practitioner. But what we're missing out on is that growth, that development, that skill building of responsibilities, ownership, communication that a graduate in other professions might get. So I think there's a lot we need to do as a profession to really build on the skills and promote best practice and really increase the number of leaders in our field. But we can only do that if we address the 5th barrier, and this is the final barrier, and we've already talked about it, but it's about training. And yes, I'll make this brief. We've already talked about very few sonographers. This isn't a current problem. If we look historically, there was a reduction in intake of sonographer training within 2014-15. So we're trying to address an imbalance. We need to look at the postgraduate diploma places, making sure they have clinical placements in the CDCs. That works, so fund it, get a quick fix, get sonographers through quickly, fund the clinical places and pay the trust for training. And then we work in the background on developing undergraduate and developing regulation for sonographers. That is the key to this, to unblocking the limited sonographers we have now. We need to get this profession regulated, and it's a plea to you, Chris, you need to put this as a priority. So that's how I see some of the problems, but there are solutions if we work together.
Thank you, Pamela. There's a tremendous amount of what you say there. As you say, solutions. I was trying to absorb as much of that as I could, but there's a lot of information, what you say. Now, I know this is going to be available for people online for some time to come, but I wonder if perhaps the text of some of what you were saying might be available on the BMUS website, or perhaps you could write to me or something like that. But there's a lot there to take up. And you'll have some questions tonight at the end of this if we have some time, but because we're pressed for time, we'll have to move on if that's okay. And we'll move from the sonographer's point of view to hear from the radiologist's perspective from Professor Adrian Lim, who of course is the president-elect of BMUS. So thank you, Adrian, and perhaps you could make your remarks, please.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everybody. It's a great honor to be here with such an esteemed panel. I just like agree with what Pam has said, and how I would like to see these diagnostic hubs working from a radiologist's perspective in terms of the main issue of workforce and staffing these, is that the person who is working in these centres should be seen to be part of a team as the whole secondary care team and not seen to be working in isolation. I think that is the key thing, is that they have to be able to feed in to the secondary hospitals and more senior people or radiologists or consultant sonographers. And to do that, part of it is that they have the infrastructure and the networking capabilities, which I know in my sector in Northwest London is being put into place, that they have, you can image share and have contact with people, more senior people at the base hospitals quite easily. And I think that is one of the key things to ensure that they're not working in isolation. But also I feel that when in these sort of places where you don't have immediate senior people around, then it needs to be someone of quite good, senior experience and knows how to deal with the situation and knows the pathways and where to turn for help. So that leads to then sort of the training and the scaling up of the workforce, as it were, that actually it does take time to gain their experience and to send these people out there. So whilst it can be done, we're talking several years to increase the radiologists and the sonographers to a degree that they can be seen to be working independently in these sort of more isolated community hubs away from the secondary hospitals. We'd like to see it as a rotation, and that not every people get to come round again for professional development and educational purposes. So that's how I see it. So one thing is that the scaling up and the education is key here, but to increase the workforce and educating them shouldn't be at the compromise of the quality of the training, as it were. So we shouldn't rush into training all these people, but with poorer quality. I think the quality and standards have to be maintained, and this takes time. As Pam says, sonographers, are radiographers first, so that's really 3 years of training and another at least 2 years to get a diploma in medical ultrasound. But then they're still quite new, and you wouldn't be sending these sort of more junior colleagues out immediately to be working on their own. You'd need someone more senior there, first of all. So then my next point about that is who's delivering these education. So yes, these academies, but there's a finite number of sort of senior colleagues who can train all these people. In time, it will get better. So a mentorship process where there'll be more people, more trainers available, but that again takes time to scale up. So I don't think we should be sort of rushing into, or we can't scale up too quickly at the compromise of losing quality of training. And then comes, which is a perennial problem which I have in my department, is that once you've trained somebody up, is to retain them. Retention of staff, and we lose, very diligent, highly qualified skilled sonographers in London, particularly where they want a better lifestyle, perhaps out of London or even into industry. So those are my sort of real issues about the workforce. Really, is it will take time, and we mustn't compromise on quality of training, and we have to look at how to retain staff once they are trained. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for being brief. That's very much appreciated, because it allows more time for questions and discussion at the end. So finally, before we do get to those questions, we have the double act I promised. We have Roy Tappin from GE Healthcare and Harshal Vaderi from Siemens. Roy is going to lead on the issue of having an open and transparent procurement process in order to provide better value for money to the CDC program. And we know procurement is again becoming a big issue because rules post-Brexit will change, and we need to look at how they'll change. And Harshal will then lead on the equipment demonstration and training virtually, and leveraging AI into the process to help make better decisions. So Roy and Harshal, it's over to you. It's exactly how you divide your time.
Okay, thanks, Chris, and good evening, everybody. First and foremost, I just want to say, as representing the ultrasound special focus group for AXREM here, we as a group want to be seen as partners with all the people that are on the panel here to drive collaboration moving forward. We actually have a duty, I believe, as an industry to help drive the innovation in the marketplace and also address these issues that have been very, well demonstrated by Pam and Adrian around training and so on. And there's two analogies that I'd just like to use before I move on to the procurement, is that we can have as many planes on the ground as we want, but if we don't have the pilots to fly them, there's no point in having the planes. And then to go to Adrian's point around, training, a fool with a tool is still a fool. So we need to make sure that the right level of training, irrespective of which discipline they come from, just to make sure that we've got the right amount of the training and proficiency of the clinical end users. Now, turning to the questions around procurement. The competitive landscape for ultrasound, there are more competitors in ultrasound than any other imaging modality. So if you actually look at the NHS supply chain, for instance, there are 12 companies, and that will expand when the new framework comes out next year. The reason why I mention that is that competition is good. I think it's the competition in ultrasound that really drives the innovation. And the innovation that's happened in ultrasound over the last 10, 15 years is phenomenal. And the actual amount of diagnostic information that's within the ultrasound wave, we only use about 10% of that. In the future, as technology increases, we'll be able to get even more diagnostic information out of ultrasound systems. And that is driven by, as I say, the innovation that's driven by the competition. And at the same time, the competition does drive the innovation, it also does drive value for money. There's no doubt about that. The competition out there means that, I believe that the health service, the NHS and private groups get the value for money that they should get from this leading edge innovation. But I would also like to just remind the panel and the audience here that value for money isn't just price. There's a big agenda at the moment around value-based procurement and what the industry can provide above and beyond, cost saving with regards to procurement of the equipment. And I think that's where we can really partner with regards to, education platforms, all the things that are required in order to drive the whole of this industry forward. And I'll just reiterate the fact that I think industry and certainly the SFG that I currently chair are trying to drive this kind of open collaboration in the marketplace. There was a question around equipment delivery, and I'm not going to duck this question. There's no doubt about it that anybody who opens the papers at the moment knows that there are global supply chain issues. And one of the questions was whether or not this was actually going to slow down delivery into the CDCs. Now, the request for help from industry is really just give us the opportunity to plan. That's all we really need to do. If we know the timescales that equipment is required, irrespective of the manufacturer that's providing the equipment, we can plan for that eventuality. What we cannot do is provide, highly complex pieces of medical equipment within, 2-3 weeks because there isn't that pre-planning. So that's a little bit of a request for help from me here. So I'll just hand over to Harshal now just to continue that theme for a second.
Thanks, Roy. And again, good evening, everyone. And to one of the points that Roy mentioned, around competition and doing demonstrations. I mean, one of the things that all of us on the vendor level, we also understand not only with the COVID restrictions, but also in order to how can we support you in the demonstration, showing you what's new. A lot of us have invested in virtual or in digital tools on how we can show equipment. So that's one way of how we're also looking at quickly innovating to make the procurement life easier for you, which also gives us more time in the planning. Coming to some of the digital tools and things that we're working on, we look at the AXREM vendors, right? We look at digital or artificial intelligence as an adjunct to radiological decision making. And what that means is when we look at the current climate today, we see the strain on the sonographers, right? So we look at ways of how can we automate or how can we reduce some of the mundane tasks that you are going through? How do we help you in that so you can be liberated to focus on the radiological decisions, right? That you need to make. And Pam, I really like your point around, patient contact counts with ultrasound. That is one of the unique parts, and that's one of the beauty of ultrasound. And again, the point is, how can we give the sonographers, but also the other care workers, how do we give you more time back with the patient or the better quality time with the patients? And these are some of those things that make a difference. And what's important here for me is when we are designing these new tools for all of us as AXREM members, it's important that we are working with the industry. And I take this action item, and Roy and I will also bring this back to our committee, is you mentioned, there's only a few consultant sonographers, but how do we get their feedback when we are designing tools? If it doesn't make a difference to you and your users, it's useless, right? It doesn't make any sense. So we'll take that call to action, and I think we're already working, but we'll take that again, is let's work with the consultant sonographers. Let's get their feedback in. So what we're designing makes a difference for you. And if nothing else, that also helps you in showing leadership in your industry with the different users that we take. So we'll take that. But the important point here is we want to collaborate with the different, with the BMUS attendees, with the BMUS audience, because again, we are here to serve you. And as Roy said, there's multiple ways of how we can add value. Is it around workflows optimization, providing you some data around that? Is it around departmental planning? Education, continuing education after we deliver the equipment? Again, these are ways of how we can add value, and we're really interested to look at how we can be of service to you.
Okay.
That's all from my end, Chris.
Thank you, Angela. That's very much appreciated. And now it's really over to everybody else to do questions. Please post them in the chat, but I have some already, and we'll see how many we can deal with. What I'm going to do is a combination of looking at the questions, seeing if I might think there's somebody obvious to do it, or asking anyone who's on the panel to perhaps raise their hand the old-fashioned way or do it properly on the Zoom by raising their hand to indicate that they'd like to come in on it. The first question I'm going to take is from Hazel, who says, opportunities to work in new ways will be extremely limited for sonographers in the absence of government regulation. How can this elephant in the room be resolved? Well, I think those are things that Pamela was talking about in her presentation. So perhaps, Pamela, you might add a little more on that issue.
Yeah, I'm sure many of the sonographers in the audience have heard me talk about this for forever, and it's been an issue since the birth of sonographers, really. Traditionally, we've taken from registered professions, and therefore I'm registered as a radiographer. I haven't practiced radiography since the year after I qualified, which is far too long ago to embarrass you on the panel here. But we really struggle to grow the profession. And if it was my daughter had asked me if she wanted to go straight into sonography, it's a brilliant profession. I've absolutely loved every minute of it, but my career would be hindered by the fact that I cannot register, and therefore I will never be able to prescribe. I will never be able to request x-rays. I will never be able to inject under a PGD. I will never be able to fulfill the advanced clinical practice framework, and the likelihood of me being a consultant sonographer is zero. So if we are going to grow the workforce, we need to recognise that it's not just the issues now to increase the numbers of trainees to undergraduate routes. It's the potential in 5, 10, 15 years' time when I've popped my clogs. We have to safeguard this profession, and a quick fix of undergraduate apprenticeship sonography to get the numbers through without that safeguard. And regulation is really essential for patients. They need to have an independent panel that can review when there has been issues of malpractice. As an employer, I can manage it, but that employee can go off to another trust, doesn't have to declare necessarily where they've worked, and that risk goes with them. With a regulated profession, they will be accountable to that profession. So we cannot grow this without getting this sorted.
Thank you. So Mike Richards will come in on this as well.
Just to say that this point was made very clearly to me during the development of my report. And I think you know, Pam, that there is actually a recommendation in my report exactly along the lines you're suggesting about regulation and registration. And yes, it does require the powers that be. And yes, that does include Chris. We can't take our foot off this pedal. I mean, because all of us working together need to make sure it actually happens this time.
Okay, thank you. And the next question I'm going to take, and I'm not sure who's best to answer this, so maybe the panelists could indicate, but this is from Catherine Kirkpatrick, and she says, why is general medical ultrasound labelled non-obstetric ultrasound? It would be much better, she says, for patient education in the workforce not to use this term. Surely it makes it sound like a poor second cousin in relation to obstetrics. A volunteer perhaps to answer that question? Might be Pamela again. Yes, very good. Well volunteered. Thank you.
There's no rationale behind this other than you've got to use your nous, and that's it. Non-obstetric ultrasound. That's what we call it in the north. Use your nous. We talked about using your brain, so that's the only way we can do it, Catherine. It's been a conundrum that we've had for years. It does sound like a negative area of practice, but I think it's because it all encompasses everything barring obstetrics. And we're set to live with it, I'm afraid, Catherine, because it goes through all the data sets that get reported back. But there's no sensible explanation for it.
Thank you. And Jill H has the question, if CDCs are outsourced, will there be an expectation for them to teach students in partnership with NHS trusts? Some AQPs do this now, but others take no responsibility for ultrasound education. Is there a volunteer for that one, or do I pick some? Andy, thank you very much indeed. I was hoping you'd volunteer on this one. Andy, go ahead, please.
So the answer is yes. We're expecting where the NHS is working in partnership with the independent sector to deliver the service through community diagnostic centres, that those independent sector suppliers will participate in training the workforce. And there's a live conversation between NHS England and Improvement and the Independent Health Care Partners Network and other representatives from the independent sector on more generally the contribution of the independent sector to training the workforce that's in progress at the moment, and the need to work as a partner with the NHS on the workforce, not just training, but also rotating staff through CDCs and acute sites is a core requirement to be a supplier of CDC services through the framework that we've established, which will be going live next week.
Thank you, Andy.
I just emphasise that word partnership. This is not the same as some of the AQP things of the past. This should be commissioned jointly between the NHS and independent sector providers, and that can be written into it that there's got to be training. At a local level, please make sure that is happening, because that is certainly the intention.
And the final question I think I'll probably be able to take is one of the ones from Roger Moshi. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He says we have to consider public expectation. The expectation that everybody who walks through the door needs an ultrasound or any imaging at all. There is so much to say, e.g. on social media and media coverage if things go wrong, etc., etc. So how are we going to manage the public expectation in relation to all of this? And again, I'll seek volunteers from the panelist. And Pamela, again, well volunteered. Thank you very much.
You'll all be sick of hearing my voice, but this is a really interesting point, Roger, and it came up yesterday in the obstetric debate as well. Patient expectation, particularly in obstetrics, is massive, but that's across the board. And I think, again, as sonographers, and it's a plea to everybody out there within the profession, we need to take some ownership over this. I think we haven't promoted what we do outside of our own profession and outside of imaging, and I think there's a lot of work to be done to say what our background is, the education that we have all gone through, what our role and responsibilities are, and where our accountability lies. And and I'm sure Adrian will support me on this. We work with delegated practice from radiologists within non-obstetric ultrasound primarily, and we need to really celebrate that collaboration with the Royal College of Radiologists and work in unison with them. But we need to identify our own profession. Going back to the regulation, I think that will help, but I don't think it's necessarily the key thing. I think we need to just really keep promoting, but also it goes to the expectations of patients. If a patient in the CDC is having a rapid diagnostic pathway, and these CDCs potentially going to do more than that, but a rapid diagnostic pathway where they're being entered into secondary care, I think sonographers, because of that patient contact, are best placed to communicate with the patient what will happen next. And that sonographer, by doing that communication, will help promote their role and also help answer those patient expectations. So there's an awful lot we need to do to improve our patient interactions.
Thanks. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for everybody who participated putting in questions. What I'm going to do is allow just a little time for each of the panelists to make perhaps a few concluding remarks. I'll give them a few seconds to get their breath together, because I'm going to do it in reverse order of the presentations which we had earlier on. I'm afraid we've only got about a minute for some concluding thoughts on such a complex and very important set of issues we've been discussing tonight. So it'll be a bit like just a minute, without deviation, hesitation, or repetition, perhaps a few concluding thoughts on the subjects we've had. And as I say, I'll do it in reverse order of the panelists we had at the beginning. So I'll come to Harshal in a second, and then I'll come to Roy, and then we'll go back in that order, concluding with Sir Mike. So Harshal, perhaps, don't feel obliged, but any concluding thoughts on this discussion?
The only thing I would say, Chris, is we have an opportunity here with the CDC planning. And if we think about it on a fundamental level, this is a good change. And it's in our interest, of course, and also the interest of the BMUS attendees of the NHS to make this work. And the fact that all three of us, all the three parties are sitting together and talking about this, for me, shows that there is good collaboration and we can work on this together, because at the end of the day, we want the integrated care networks to succeed, and that is our joint goal. And I'm really happy to see that and work further closely with the organizations.
Thank you. Key buzzwords, I would say, in the health and care debate yesterday: integration and collaboration, emphasized repeatedly by people, and I think that's a good thing. And we'll go now to Roy Tappin. Perhaps your concluding thoughts, please.
Yeah, just very briefly, once again, there's no doubt about it, collaboration and integration, two key words, but we're discussing CDCs here, but this situation will get as we move forward. Sorry, my computer just went dead then, sorry about that. The ultrasound will and is becoming more and more ubiquitous. So the role of ultrasound across all of the different areas of medicine is starting to become more and more prolific. So this situation with regards to training and so on, and the advancements in the technology, which is very, very rapid, these are issues that are going to get worse, not better, moving forward, unless we really start to address these issues head on. And I think, we've got a very good starting point here with this kind of collaboration and developing to address them together.
Thank you. I think we're all remarkably consistent, which is very good, and not entirely pre-planned, but is always best when it works out that way. And now, Adrian, if you wouldn't mind, perhaps any final thoughts for us this evening?
Thank you, Chris. Again, the collaboration is key here, and but also not at the also at the local level. And here we are collaborating with all the people providing the service, but we perhaps need to get some views also of people who will use the service and what is useful for them. So I think everybody needs to be involved, particularly at the local level, to provide best patient care.
Absolutely, that's very good. And Pamela, as president of BMUS, thank you very much indeed for working obviously with AXREM to bring all this together. I think it's been a very good discussion. You dealt with a few specific points, but there's so much in what you were saying. Perhaps if you wouldn't mind reflecting on the contributions other people have made and your final thoughts for the evening. Sorry, you need to unmute. They tell you actually in the House of Lords Hansard these days, the word used most commonly in Hansard is unmute,
Yeah,
as a result of all the time we've been doing things virtually. So Pamela, go ahead, please.
I think it's fabulous. The collaboration tonight has been key, and absolutely take on board the words from Andy, Chris, and the manufacturers. And I think what I've learned tonight is there are actually some massive solutions to this. I think we've got some quick, easy wins. Number one, invest in what we've got in terms of capacity for training, and that's a plea to HEE to really continue to support that. We need to maximise with AXREM to get best value for money. There's an easy win there. Let's get invested with some ultrasound equipment. It's easy to install. Let's maximise on defining pathways to avoid duplication and improve further collaboration. Let's maximise on the development of these CDCs. It's really heartening to hear that actually the intention is collaboration between independent sector and NHS to ensure training is embedded within the CDC. And finally, let's maximise the role of sonographer. Let's really support leadership development and define the career. But most of all, let's regulate the profession and get that untapped demand coming through.
Thank you. That's a really good peroration for what we're talking about tonight. And as I said before, we're extremely grateful to Andy Howlett for taking part in all of this and full of admiration for all his great efforts to drive these things forward. Andy, having heard what other people have said tonight, perhaps a final thought or two in a minute or two.
Yeah, great contributions from everybody. I think for me, the focus needs to be workforce, and that encompasses the opportunities from technology that our manufacturers have identified, the issues around leadership and advanced practice that Pam has identified, and how we attract people into the profession at junior levels and enable them through training to work their way through to those upper echelons and make a big contribution.
Thank you, Andy. As ever, really appreciated. And I'm going to conclude with Sir Mike Richards, because his report has helped provide so much stimulus to actually trying to get things done in this area. He, of course, now is concerned about how you and others are delivering all of this. So, Mike, I know if I had an hour left, you could probably talk for an hour on this subject, but we have about 3 minutes or so, if you wouldn't mind. Your reflections, perhaps, on the discussion we've had, and please tell us what you think.
Well, I suppose my main reflection is the degree of coherence amongst the panelists. We are actually all saying much the same thing. I think we are identifying the same challenges, the same barriers, but also the same potential solutions. And I think one of the other key things that I would say here, and I think Harshal said it as well, was we have an opportunity. Diagnostics generally has tended not to be in the limelight of the health service, and I've been in the health service a very long time, and I think longer than everybody else here. So it is a very good thing that it is now getting the limelight, but we've got to use this opportunity. We've got the focus on it, we've got the funding. I'm sure we'd all want more, but we've got good funding. Equally, we have got, both between NHS England and Health Education England, a diagnostics workforce board. They are actually recognising the challenges here, and we need to make sure that they are focused on it, and we will push the regulation and registration point as hard as we can. So I think let's grasp this. It's not going to be easy. Nobody's saying it is going to be easy, because we're coming from a low starting point in terms of numbers, not in terms of quality, but a low starting point in terms of numbers of machines and of staff. So growing from that is always going to be difficult. But if we all do it together, I genuinely believe we can. And ultimately, the people who will benefit will be our patients.
Thank you so much. And all that remains tonight is for me to thank all of our panelists, Professor Sir Mike Richards, Andy Howlett, Pamela Parker, Adrian Lim, Roy Tappin, and Harshal Vadera. Thank you all very much indeed for making excellent contributions. I'd like to thank BMUS and AXREM for putting this event together. I think it's been very useful. The discussion has indicated many challenges for us, but also great opportunities if we can deliver. Thank you all very much indeed, everyone who's participated in this, and particular thanks to Emma and Jane, who behind the scenes worked on moderating what we need to do on Zoom. It's been an excellent evening. I've learned so much. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. And if I don't see all of you before, and I almost certainly won't, have a very happy Christmas with all those you spend the time with. Thank you and good night.